Hello again, everyone. I'm Mark Walmsley. I'm the founder of the Arts and Culture Network. We're a growing global community of over 185,000 now across our LinkedIn groups. I don't get to meet everyone, of course, but when I do, it's a great pleasure. And Scott Flynn has joined me today. Scott is one of our new full members, for which many thanks because we're entirely member funded as a community. It's great to have you here, Scott. Thank you for joining me for this today.
My pleasure, Mark. Very glad to be here.
Fantastic. Now we're going to have some fun. I'm going to create your fantasy cultural year from the answers to some easy questions to which there are no wrong answers. And it's a lovely way we've found of pulling out anecdotes, preferences, surprises, and conversational detours. So
Cool.
we'll get to that in a moment. But before I do that, perhaps you'd be kind enough to say hi to everyone, tell us where you're based, and a bit about you and the work that you do.
Sure. Yeah. So my name's Scott. I actually just recently moved to London about 6 months ago. Before that, I spent my life in various parts in the States, New York, Boston, Virginia, and then Colorado. So I'm a musician. I'm a composer. I'm a band leader. I'm an improviser, performer. I play the trombone, but also use other sort of electronic instruments and things like that. And I've been primarily a performer and composer for the bulk of my career. I've recently started a an online trombone mentorship program, so I've been doing a lot more education. And yeah, I like I said, I'm in London now and looking forward to expanding and seeing what I can do here in the UK and in Europe in general. Um, yeah, that's a sort of quick version of what I do, I'd say.
That's perfect. And it's given me inspiration for your fantasy cultural year.
Excellent.
So, if anyone would like to learn more about Scott and the work that he does, it's at scottflynnmusic.com. And here he is on his website. There we go. Just sharing so people can have a look. Here's Smiling Scott on, and there's loads on here, which is great. I've had a quick look before our meeting. So
Nice.
there's a mini reel there. Um, and the master classes and the mentoring. So
Hmm.
scottflynnmusic.com to learn more about the work that Scott does. Right, here we go. Now, I need to place you somewhere in the world, and I gave you a little
Okay.
warning about this first question. Um, the first thing that comes to mind is often the most telling. So I need to place you somewhere in the world. So I'm going to ask you, what's your favorite building? It could be a building that you know and love, or a building that you have never been to but would love to, anywhere in the world. What building is going to be your favorite?
I love this question, but unfortunately, I don't know if I have one answer. I have like because you did mention this beforehand, and so I have sort of like three categories of like building. I don't know if that's acceptable, but
Yeah, this is your fantasy cultural year. Yes.
okay, cool. Well, so when I think favorite, granted, my mind right now is in sort of creativity mode as we're doing this, so I think about venues because some of my favorite buildings are where cultural experiences and musical experiences, obviously in particular, are some of my favorite spaces. So I'd say there's a category of like venue that is beautiful and outdoors. I've played Red Rocks a lot. That's really special. I played this some. I want to say it was not Chart. It was some beautiful festival in France. So I like some beautiful festival in France where I love, and there's another one in Colorado, and there's the Gorge in Washington State. So I love outdoor beautiful performance spaces. I love larger, intimate, beautiful spaces, which comes like so. I've done a lot of touring in the States, and Hampton Coliseum is one in particular. It's like a very large venue, but it feels very intimate. Um, I also, I mean, I love Carnegie Hall. I love the Royal Albert Hall, and I also love smaller, more intimate spaces. Things like Blue Note, things like Ronnie Scott's, and so that's. I mean, I guess I like intimate venues and beautiful venues and nature, outdoor, indoor, outdoor sort of spaces as well. That's a very broad
I love
answer.
that. We're going to go with Red Rock.
Let's do it.
So I'm just going to show everybody by sharing my screen. Here we go. This looks wonderful.
Oh, it's great.
So Yeah. So there we go. I'd like you to imagine that you're sitting um, here in the audience, and there's a bar, um, and there is a drink. It's June, 6 p.m., Friday evening, concert ahead, um, and there's a drink on the table next to you. What would we find there?
Oh, let's see. I guess my two, well, I would say either a sort of nice, refreshing IPA beer, but I'm also a coffee nut, so I love a really good, like, high quality, like a nice single origin, like iced coffee or cold brew or something like that. So those would be, it'd be one of those two things that I would
Okay,
probably
we'll
go
go
for.
with the beer.
Oh, let's
We'll
go for
go
the
with
beer.
the beer.
You're gonna have to keep me in
Um,
line because I'll give you like four answers for
I
each of
know.
these questions.
Well, this is what happens when you interview polymaths.
Yes. Yes,
Um,
exactly.
and there's a book on the table next to you. There's one book
Mm.
on the table
Okay,
next to you.
one book.
Okay.
Gotcha. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It could be your favorite book. It could be a book that's changed your life,
Mm-hmm.
or a recent discovery. What would we find there?
Yeah, so I'll go with the first. This one is a little easier. This one that comes to mind. Um, a mentor of mine, Art Landy, is a piano player, composer, teacher. He wrote a book with his colleague Mark Miller called, I think it's called Being Music. I actually, it's a short book that's all about um, how to how best to sort of improvise freely. So a lot of
Oh,
my heart, I love all types of music, but in the past few years, I've been really deeply resonating with very open music, open improvised, free jazz, etc., avant-garde, whatever, sort of everything from very strange to just open and explorative and things like that. And that book that he wrote is one of my favorite books on that topic. And it was the kind of book that, like, it's not that, it's a thin book. When I finished it, I was like, I'm just going to go right back to page one and read it again because it just sort of captured a lot of things. And it was the kind of things that I really wanted to really deeply sort of ingest creatively and artistically. And it's one of these books I don't actually even have a copy now because I buy it and give it away and buy it and give it away. And so I'm due for another copy. Um, and yeah, I think it's by Art Landy. It's either called Being Music or The Art of Being or something like that. And
yeah.
um,
That's,
clearly my
that's
favorite book, and I can't quite remember the title, but it's just that book in my mind.
fantastic. That's great. So we've got the book, the drink, and the venue. Now you're feeling quite pleased with yourself because you've just come from a meeting at Red Rock with um, some a wealthy Arizonian, is that correct?
I think so. Arizona and Arizonian. Yeah, sure.
Arizonian family foundation who
Okay.
love to invest in projects around the avant-garde, improvisation, free jazz.
Nice.
Okay, they'd like to hire you for a year at great expense, to travel the world to put together recordings and videos of you improvising with musicians in various areas of the world. A kind of cultural mishmash, but it's all based on improvisation. But you'll be working with musicians from different cultures, different styles. Um, a TV crew is going to follow you because they'd like to make a documentary about this. Um, and when you get back, you're invited to do a TED talk. Friends and family can come and visit you while you're traveling the world during this year. Um, you get a book deal as well, and a university lecture tour after you've completed the year. It's extremely well paid and it's first class all the way. And you can work with some of your heroes if you choose. Does that sound like fun, Scott?
You're so good at this. Of course, that sounds. I was like, oh, this is fun for me, but I could see this being also fun for you. Like you just absolutely, yeah. Of course, yes, that would be amazing.
Fantastic. So we need to start somewhere in the world.
Mhm.
So we're currently in Arizona. We're going to hop on a plane. You turn left when you get on the plane, by the way. Where are we going? Where would you like to start?
um, I'd probably start in New York.
Perfect. So if we're on our way to New York now, the steward brings you an IPA and a note from the Family Foundation back in Arizona. They have a musical challenge for you, which, given the work you do, is going to be quite hard, I suspect. They'd like you to limit your musical listening to one very specific genre or type of music for 12 months, to the exclusion of all else.
Hmm.
In those circumstances, what would you choose?
I had to pick a genre.
Hmm.
Well, in the spirit of the conversation, I guess I'll give. There's two qualifying answers because there's one artist that comes to mind that is prolific enough that I could listen to their music for an entire year, which is in the vein of this. So I would say if I had to, genre and style are a little, they can be nebulous, but I would say avant-garde music. And the other thing that comes to mind is Sun Ra, who's a big influence to me. And so I don't know which answer feels more appropriate.
You get a
And
bit more breadth if you go for the genre rather than the artist,
okay,
but yeah, but that's
yeah,
I
you
love
know,
that.
avant-garde, improvisation, jazz, that sort of Venn diagram. If I had to pick one, I would say avant-garde.
Right. Great. Now you arrive in New York and a group of young musicians welcome you. They whisk you to a wonderful apartment overlooking Central Park. Now, don't forget, I've got a magic wand and a time machine at my disposal for this. They said, settle down, unpack. We're going to come back and take you to a dance performance followed by dinner. Now, I can put any dance performance on the stage in front of you, dance-based performance. Um, it can be any style, any group, any dancers, living or not. What would you like me to put on the stage in front of you?
I wish I knew more about dance. I would say it's tough because yeah, this is some. Well, okay, so there's a. Oh, my wife was a ballerina, and there's one troupe company, something that I think is New York based that comes to mind, and of course I can't remember it. I want to say it's primarily African American focused, but they cover a lot of avant garde. So I mean, this is a tough one because I'm not really well versed in the world of dance, but I would.
No, that's fine. You've conjured up something that looks great. There's Alvin Ailey.
Yes, that's what it is. Thank you.
Yeah,
It's Alvin Ailey.
great.
Yeah, that's the
Yeah,
one that comes to mind. I'm not super versed in what they do, besides the fact that they range from. What I learned is everyone who works with them is strong in fundamentals, but they're doing contemporary, explorative, different, modern things, and so
yeah.
that was appealing to me.
So that's Alvin Ailey, American Dance Theatre, the gold standard of modern dance. This world-renowned company champions the African American cultural experience on the global stage. You can watch their iconic performances or take classes at their primary home, the Joan Weil Center for Dance in Manhattan. Great choice. Now they're going to take you out to dinner afterwards. You get to choose the national cuisine. New York offers everything. What national cuisine are we going for?
I, I'm gonna say the first one that comes to mind. I'm gonna say Japanese, even though I love so much food from everywhere. But I'll go Japanese.
Great choice. Now we're going to buzz again. Where are we going next from New York? Anywhere in the world.
Let's see. From New York, let's go to. Well, ooh, tough. I'm thinking between Berlin and Tokyo.
Mm.
Um,
You can go to Tokyo afterwards if you wish.
okay, let's start with we'll start with Berlin.
Okay, now in Germany, when you get there, it's sport day. Okay. We've had breakdancing in the Olympics. We've got ice dancing, gymnastics to music. Much sport is performance art. I can put any sporting event in front of you in Berlin. Anything from history. You can go back in time. You can
Ooh,
take part if you wish. Um, what would you love to have in front of you
wow,
from the world of sport?
what an interesting question. And one it's tricky for me because well, general decisions are can be hard. I can struggle with, but I'm not much of a sports person. But that said, let me think. Um, well, I mean, I mean, I like to play ultimate frisbee. I don't know if that's the most high, but then I'm like,
Yeah, no, that's good. The
we could
World
just
Championships, the World
sure,
Championships are in Berlin while we're there.
great, cool,
There we
we'll do
go.
that. Yeah.
Fantastic. Now we're going to go to Tokyo,
Okay.
and a group of young musicians and keen on improvisation are welcoming you there. You're in um, a beautiful loft apartment overlooking a cherry orchard and a palace. Um, and they have a new digitally enhanced art gallery in Tokyo. It's an immersive experience. It's not projection. You put on some virtual reality glasses and you can step into the work of a famous artist. You
Hmm.
can walk around. It's three dimensions, 360 degrees. There is movement and there is sound. You can see in three dimensions um, what the artist could only show us in two. So, is there an artist whose work you'd like to explore in that way?
Yeah, I guess there's a few, but I guess I should choose one. And this person came up, and I'm not, again, an expert, but the few that I've seen have been very intrigued. So I'll say Kandinsky,
Oh, yeah,
even though part of me is like, well, there's Jackson Pollock and there's Basquiat comes to mind as well.
yeah.
But we'll go with Kandinsky.
Okay, here's Kandinsky. There we go. Yeah, wonderful. That's
Yeah,
going to be quite a trip walking around in there, isn't it?
absolutely.
Fantastic. That's great. Um, Now I'm going to buzz you back to London, and we're going out together every night of the week to do something cultural. And between us, we can choose what we do. Okay, and we still have the magic wand and the time machine. Um, Monday is going to be, we're going to go back in time to a performance, a musical performance that you want to experience again. Tuesday is a theatre play. Wednesday is a West End or Broadway musical. Thursday is opera or ballet, and Friday is movie night. And between us, we can choose what we see. So, is there a concert that you went to, or a performance, a live performance, that if you had a time machine and could go back to experience again, what would that be? Or it could be one
Wow.
you didn't go to.
Right. Um, oof. This is a really great question. It's not easy. I have to pick one, don't
Hmm.
I? um, yeah, I guess I'm gonna. Let's see. I'm torn between Sun Ra, who I
Hmm.
never saw play live, and like Bach, because I'm assuming he played in London. And I don't actually know. I don't actually know if he did, but it would be something or
We
like
can we
Rachmaninoff, or
Yeah, Sun Ra's a great choice.
we'll do Sun Ra.
Um, my biggest regret in that respect is not going to Bob Marley in '79.
Oh man, that's another like I love reggae, and so Bob
Yeah.
Marley absolutely up there.
The closest I got was on my honeymoon 8 years ago. We went to the Reggae Sunsplash in Jamaica,
Oh
and
nice,
and that had Ziggy Marley, Robert Marley,
nice,
and Sean Paul. So
cool.
I said to the concierge, "What is it? 7:30 for eight? That kind of thing." He said, "No, it's more like 11:30 for midnight." Sean Paul came on at 5 a.m. Um,
That's crazy.
yeah, it was red stripe and ganja and rum everywhere. It was brilliant.
I'm sure.
Yeah, excellent. Okay. Now we're in London. We've got the Shakespeare's Globe, of course. Is there
Hmm.
a theatre play that you'd really like to go and see?
Oh, let's see. So a play. Um, I, oof. And this is where it's like I know some things, but I don't know enough. I mean, if I trying to
or I
think.
can choose one for you if you prefer.
Well, yeah, sure. What do you have in mind? That might help. I
Well,
mean,
we have a Shakespeare expert in our group,
oh,
um,
nice.
and he's often suggested that if you want a really good introduction to Shakespeare, Measure for Measure is the place to start. So,
I would love a proper Shakespeare. Like
yeah.
I've this and that, and I've seen some productions, not a ton, but it'd be
Mm.
great. Like Shakespeare is one of these. I mean, such depth and such
Yeah,
breadth that it would be great to do that.
yeah,
I'd be
the
happy
big
with that
man,
choice.
the big
Yes,
man.
yes, exactly.
Um, Excellent. Now, a West End or a Broadway musical. We can go to the premiere back in
Hmm.
time if you wish.
Oh well, I am a sucker for Les Mis, even though that's actually still happening.
Mm,
Here, it's not happening in the U.S. anymore.
mm.
Uh, so that would be yeah. Let's go
Yeah,
with that. Let's go with that. Yeah.
I saw it when it was at the Barbican Centre with the
Ooh,
Royal
nice.
Shakespeare Company before it transferred, and it was wonderful. The first half was an hour and three quarters though, which is
Oh
so you
yeah.
don't have a drink before the show.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Excellent. Now, if you had to choose between opera and ballet, which would you choose?
Probably pick opera.
Do you have
Um,
a favorite or
this is another thing where I'm not much of an expert, and I know that. Oh well, I mean, there's some of the classics which I'm intrigued with, like um, obviously Mozart and like Verdi. I mean, it's a thing that I'm not super versed in, but
yeah?
isn't Carmen Burana? That's a piece in an opera. Is that right?
Carmen is an opera by
Carmen
Bizet.
is an opera.
Yeah,
Yes, that's right,
Carmina
by Bizet.
Burana is a kind of symphonic work. I've
Okay,
I've played both.
nice. That's good. I'm showing my limitations of
No,
cultural
no,
awareness here.
that's
Um,
great. So Carmen, yeah, that's a great opera set in Seville.
yeah.
But for me, the art form peaks at Puccini with La Boheme
Mm.
and Turandot and some of the belting arias that you get out of that. So some people argue that it's the ultimate art form because you've got visual art in the scenery, you've got acting, you've got dancing, you've got singing, and you've got a symphony orchestra under the stage.
Right.
So yeah.
I'd be more inclined to take your recommendation that you just gave more than Bizet,
Yeah,
just
Tosca,
because Tosca.
Tosca. Oh yeah, there's a wonderful dramatization of it on Apple TV,
Cool.
and it's just incredible, really good.
Nice.
So we're nearly there. Friday is film night. Let's go to the Sphere in Las Vegas.
Great.
Huge.
Yeah.
I've not been, but I'd love to. We've got the place to ourselves. Okay. We can sit in the best possible seats. What are we watching?
Oh man, these are such good questions. Whew. Yeah, I guess I'll go with my. I'll try to stay on the side of what's the first thing that comes to mind.
Hmm.
The first thing that came to mind was Space Odyssey 2001. Um,
Fantastic. And won't that be great on that screen?
right? Yeah.
Yeah. And the
Um,
music.
yeah. I mean, don't get me
It was
wrong. There's
so
so
far
many.
ahead of its time,
Yeah.
like 20, 30 years ahead of its time. Yeah, I mean, it's incredible movie. I watched it a few months ago again, and just
Nice.
it's one of those movies you can't start and then stop. You know.
No, it's
Yeah.
such a unique film.
I'm binging my way through the movies that were scored by John Williams and directed by
Oh,
Steven
cool.
Spielberg. There's
Oh,
about
nice.
20 of them. You
Wow, there's that
gradually,
many.
yeah, yeah. The first one I've got in front of me, it's where is it? The Sugarland Express
Oh,
is the
cool.
first one, 74, and it comes right up to date for the latest Indiana Jones one. It goes right through Saving Private Ryan, E.T.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a great binge.
yeah, it is a really good binge. Excellent. Now we're nearly there. I'm about to send you off to continue your wonderful fantasy cultural year. But before I do, I'm going to give you a hero lunch in London, Japanese
Oh,
restaurant. You can invite a hero. It can be anyone you like, famous or otherwise, living or not, fictional or not.
Ooh, okay. Um, well, that's so funny because part of me again wanted to go Sun Ra, but part of me is also like, oh, it's a tough one. There's also, wow. Um, oof, this is yeah. Okay,
Hmm.
I have to pick one. Um, I hate to beat a dead horse with Sun Ra because there's so many others, particularly from the past. I would say here, let's do this. Let's do for this. I would do Bach.
Nice.
I would do Bach for this. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Not a note out of place.
correct.
So
Correct. I
yeah.
mean, just to yeah, just to sort of try to think, conceive. That I'm so fascinated by that process because you hit the nail on the head. Not a note out of place, and it's almost like you can play it fast, slow, static, emotional, and it's
Mm,
still like you could put it into a computer. It'd be MIDI, right? It'd be
yeah.
lifeless, and it would still have so much there to it.
And you get the sense that it's almost improvised as well.
Yeah, it's
Sort of not planned, but beautiful and structured and so well thought out. Yes, you can have Bart. There we
cool.
go.
Done.
There we go. Scott, that's your fantasy cultural year. I hope you've enjoyed it. You get to do the
That's
TED Talk. The book deal is done. The TV series is out and very popular on Netflix. You're on the sofa of morning television all the time. You're the go-to commentator when anyone wants an expert in improvisation and the avant-garde. Um, have you enjoyed your fantasy cultural year?
it's been lovely. Thank you.
Thank you so much again for being one of our full members. Wherever this appears, if you'd like to get in touch with Scott, there'll be links and contact details. But for the time being, Scott, thank you so much for being a good sport and sharing your fantasy cultural year.
My pleasure. It's been a joy.